Good morning, everyone. We ask that you place your table trays in the upright position and the seatbelt sign is on. It is a blessing to see all of you here this morning. It is a blessing in this post-COVID world to see anyone in person. And so welcome to the Gettysburg campus of United Lutheran Seminary. I'm Pastor Marty. I work here putting together continuing ed events, and it's just really exciting to have such a wonderful crowd this morning. For Dr. Erwin's lecture, I'm going to share a little bit about our president now. Dr. Erwin was appointed president of ULS and the ministerium of the Pennsylvania Chair and Professor of Reformation Studies in August of 2020. He was the fourth bishop of the Southwest California Synod of the ELCA from 2013 to 2020. He was the ELCA's first gay partnered bishop and the first openly gay male to serve in that office in any of the churches of the Lutheran World Federation. As an enrolled member of the Osage Nation, on whose reservation he was born in Oklahoma, he was also the first indigenous bishop in the ELCA. In the ELCA Conference of Bishops, he served on the executive committee and as Region 2 liaison bishop to the ELCA Church Council and as chair of the Bishops' Theological and Ethical Concerns Committee. From 2000 until his election as Synod Bishop, Dr. Erwin held a chair in Lutheran confessional theology at California Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks. At Cal Lutheran, he taught in the religion and history departments and served as faculty chair for 2 years. During the Reformation anniversary year in 2017, Dr. Erwin was in high demand as a teacher and speaker and gave 30 lectures and presentations in the United States and Germany in addition to his normal duties as bishop. Dr. Erwin received a Fulbright grant for 2 years of study at the University of Tübingen in Germany and an IREX grant for a year at the University of Leipzig. His doctoral dissertation was on the late medieval roots of Luther's theology of the cross, and his subsequent scholarly work has focused on the religious culture of Lutheranism, particularly its worship and piety, with a special interest in the visual arts and architecture. Dr. Erwin moved with his husband Robert T. Flynn, a West Virginia native and YDS alumnus, Yale Divinity School alumnus, here with offices on both campus. Dr. Erwin and Mr. Flynn split their time between their home near Philadelphia and the Lures house here on the Gettysburg campus. And I might also add, he is a wonderful traveling companion. The conversations are amazing. I need to start recording them. So without any further ado, President Erwin.
Thank you so much. We also have, as many of you know, because you read my occasional reflections, we also have a parrot named Echo who travels with us between our two homes. We were joking the other day that it's too bad she isn't a homing pigeon, because then she could go on her own and wouldn't have to come with us in the car. But a pet completes a home, as many of you know, so it really seems to us as though we're going from one home to another as long as we can bring Echo along. Before I begin the lecture this morning, which will begin with some explanation of why I'm giving this particular lecture on this particular topic, I'd like to invite you to join me in prayer. The Lord be with you. And also with you. Let us pray. Holy Trinity, one God, you show us the splendor of diversity and the beauty of unity in your own divine life. Make us, who came from many nations with many languages, a united people that delights in our many different gifts. Defend our liberties and give those whom we have entrusted with authority the spirit of wisdom, that there might be justice and peace in our land. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ, our sovereign and our Savior. Amen. So again, as Pastor Martin said, good morning, welcome to you. I want to thank especially the people who make this possible through technology, and welcome those who are with us, both viewing on the YouTube feed and present by Zoom. We have people here in many different modalities, not just the ones in the room, but it is, of course, especially gratifying to see the people who have made it here physically It's so encouraging to be able to have even a half-filled room, again, as the pandemic wanes into an endemic, where we will simply have to be careful going forward, but not completely upset our lives. So I will confess to you, one shouldn't begin lectures with a confession, but one of the things that I do want to say is that I was asked to give this lecture before I had any idea what I was going to talk about. And I know a lot of things about a lot of things, I'll give you that, but I'm not always sure people will be as interested in them as I am. So I wanted to do something that was more generally accessible than the scholarly work that I do for my own gratification and for the edification of those few who care about it, and think more generally about our life together in society here and now, in this country, and in our place in history. And I'm motivated to do that in part because of my work as Synod Bishop before coming into the office of President of ULS. In that role, I was frequently called upon to offer opinions on issues of the day. I wrote op-ed pieces, I gave talks, I was frequently called by reporters to get the church's view on this thing or that thing, or the Christian view on one thing or another. This is very frustrating for a scholar, as you can imagine, because we always have to condition what we say to be only about what we really think we can speak on with authority, which in my case had very little to do with current events sometimes. But as a historian, I think everything has a context. And so it didn't keep me from having an opinion on things I didn't know a great deal about, at least insofar as I could set what was happening to us now in the broader context of where we've been and the kind of people we are through the forces, both spiritual and material, that shape our identity as human beings and members of a particular society. We're all embedded in the same one in the United States. And I'll start with another apology, and that is that I'm going to use the term America frequently in this lecture, by which I mostly mean the United States, recognizing that there is more to America than the US. But in our context, the United States is the dominant idea. And the term America has been very frequently used within the United States to mean our own national identity. As you can see from the picture, one of the things that motivated me in this particular moment to talk about the challenge of the broken promises of the American dream is the anger that's present in our society and has come to visible status very recently in very many ways. This is not a new thing. I think anyone who looks closely will see that the roots of today's anger are very deep, actually centuries deep, and they touch a lot of what it means to be American. But they seem to have come to a head in some particular ways in the last few years and then been amplified and made visible to us through the media that we all consume in great numbers. And what concerns me most, and I've used the picture of the insurrection on January 6th at the Capitol building as a reminder. I'm going to use pictures throughout this lecture, but I'm not going to put too many words on the screen so that you'll listen to me instead. I'm one of those people who is constantly in the struggle between the eye and the ear. And in my case at least, whenever there's something to see, the eye wins, and I stop listening. I can't watch cable news that have a crawler at the bottom because I have to read the crawler, even if I've seen it 100 times already, because it's words. And I stop listening. So this is the other way around, few words and more listening. But what I'm concerned about is the breakdown in discourse within the United States, the ability to talk to one another across meaningful lines. Our keynote speaker, Kirsten Powers, will talk about that, and her book, Saving Grace, is about how to rekindle conversation between people of opposing views. But I'll leave that to her and talk today about what I see as the problem that we're trying to fix. That we've moved, I think in a visible way, from simple polarization on the political spectrum to actual hatred between groups, at least if you take people's words seriously. And there is some conversation worth having about whether words posted on social media, for example, should be taken at face value. They certainly aren't always posted by people who mean exactly what they're saying. Now, that being said, they are what they are, as a famous politician liked to say, and if they are hateful, that needs to be called out regardless of the motive behind them. But I see a breakdown in discourse, a move from simple polarization toward actual hatred, and this underscores the fragility of the social contract in our country. What seems to me, at least, and I come from a perspective I'll describe in more detail in a minute, from my standpoint, this looks like an unprecedented willingness to disregard the good of other people, the well-being of other people, to sacrifice that for the sake of one group's advantage. And I think that, of course, we've been shaken into realizing that our constitutional order is fragile, more fragile than most of us who grew up on American civics would think. From the Supreme Court down to the Congress, everything seems shakier. The idea that the government stands for the best, for the most people, is not a current idea anymore in the same way. And so the anger and polarization in our society, I think, is a peril and a danger to our democratic system. I'll give credit to U.S. News and World Report for the photograph, by the way. So I used the American dream as a construct by which I thought I would organize part of this lecture, and that requires me to tell you a little bit about that expression and where it comes from. Of course, the idea is very old. It goes back to the very beginnings of the settlement of North America by Europeans, and it is enshrined for most of us most vividly and memorably in the Declaration of Independence, which famously offers equality to all men. Of course, it says in the text, but it means all fully empowered citizens with rights to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, that was itself already a limiting factor. It did not include women, did not include enslaved persons, did not include indigenous persons, or anyone who didn't fit within the conventional understanding of what a fully empowered citizen was in the context of the time. But it was an interesting amateur historian, public thinker named James Truslow Adams, who in 1931 first actually described what he called the American dream. And he wrote a number of popular history books, the most successful of which was one called The Epic of America, written in 31, but remained in print until the 1950s. It still can be acquired. It was enormously successful and influential. And it is a kind of an overarching positive view of how American history works, that it was founded on a principle of equality and justice and opportunity, and that has been fulfilled better and better in every succeeding generation until his own time. It was not, as I say, a new idea, but it came at a particular moment at which Americans, and especially thought leaders in America, were feeling the importance of the United States over and against all the other countries of the world. Adams was not related, by the way, to the famous Massachusetts Adamses. He was a Marylander. Adams was an advisor to President Wilson and participated in the lead up to the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles. So he comes into the American story at a time in which the United States is becoming a country that gets to decide for other countries, at least to a very great degree, what liberty, what nationality means, in a time in which America was helping divide up the map of Europe in complicated and problematic ways that still bedevil us even now in current events. Adams was part of that conversation, a pinnacle of American power in the world up to that point, and only exceeded by the post-war, post-Second World War redrawing of the maps that America was also part of. And part of Adams' emphasis in the book is how much better America is than Europe, how much better we've answered the questions of living together in society, of how to have a democratic form of government, how to create opportunity for our citizens without a stratifying class structure and all of the things that held Europeans back. And I think that is that's an idea that is really, among intellectuals, more critiqued than admired today. But it's still one that has some currency with us. We still actually you can whip up opinion against a policy by calling it foreign or by calling it European. Many people don't know that we came very close to having a national health system at the beginning of the 20th century in the Theodore Roosevelt administration, and after that, that was essentially defeated by a PR campaign that labeled it as German, being too German, and so therefore authoritarian and inhibiting American freedom. This was largely, as I said, a PR campaign, but it had currency because of the association with foreigners. Adams's definition of the American dream was that in every generation of American life, life should be better and richer for everyone, with opportunity for each according to their ability or their achievement. That right there limits, in so many ways, our critical modern eyes see this, and we already begin to think about, what does ability mean? How are you going to decide what achievement is? What is really being fair here? But Adams is piling on to a tradition of understanding of the relationship between the goods of life and a sense of deserving that people have. I think underlying quite a lot of this is an idea that God helps those who are deserving, in a way. Of course, they help themselves, as Benjamin Franklin would say, and therefore God helps them. And this association between being well off and being deserving is deeply embedded in our American ways of thinking. It comes, I think, out of Calvinism mostly, but it is, I mean, Lutherans would never say that humans deserve anything. Everything comes by grace. But that's not a very good way to explain an economic system. So, or a very effective galvanizer of individual action toward some personal achievement. So I can blame Calvinism more for it. But what it has created is, within our country today, a gap between those who feel they deserve more than they have and those they see as receiving goods they don't deserve by the standards of the first group. This is articulated really well in a book that many of you have probably read called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, by Arlie Hochschild, which was published in 2016. And I think even though it actually predates the Trump administration, it really lays out well, by her study of reasonably poor white people, especially in the American South, the underpinnings of a way of looking at things that would be willing to deny themselves advantages for the sake of keeping them from people they thought didn't deserve them. That a sense of deserving that is embedded so deeply that it actually could be used as an argument to deprive themselves. And this is something I think is fundamentally challenging in our society. It's theologically extraordinarily questionable and also politically unhelpful. So who am I to talk about this? I don't claim special expertise. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a political scientist. I'm only a historian, and at that, a historian of European Christianity. So my approach on this is sort of an outsider's approach, although as one of the reasons I avoided the technical study of American history when I was growing up is that I thought being part of it, we were already so familiar with our history that it was more useful to study the history of someplace far away. But as I've grown older, I've realized how deeply I have been impacted by the history that surrounds me, in which I have grown up. No one can live in a place where in North America, where European settlers have been as long as they have been in Pennsylvania, without having a strong sense of the generations of history that surround us here locally, but also in the nation as a whole. So I approach this with the tools of a historian. Also, I use a theological perspective because my training is in the history of theology. And I ask, what is it that people believe as they are acting in a particular way, as they're living out their lives in a public sense? And although I am deeply associated with, in my own family story, with the settlement of North America by Europeans, many of my ancestors, by far the larger number of my ancestors were people who came here from Europe, like most of your ancestors, I expect. I have some who were not. I have some who were here already, the members of the Osage Nation, who, although they didn't understand themselves in those terms, they already were an autonomous group of human beings who lived their lives for generations and centuries, in fact, on pieces of land that they thought of as being part of creation's gift to humankind, without any sense of direct personal ownership, and with a trust that from year to year, the Creator, manifest in nature, would take care of them and give them sustenance. What Europeans would see as a primitive way of understanding the relationship between humans and nature, but one that had sustained these people for centuries, and of course had caused them to move as they needed to move across the continent to secure more reliable sources of food. By the time Europeans arrived, my Osage ancestors had moved from the Ohio Valley into the Mississippi Valley, had moved west onto the prairie, and adapted themselves to a semi-nomadic lifestyle that involved following the herds of bison across the prairie. They were mostly hunters. But in the season when the bison were too far away or were not moving, they were easier to hunt when they were either rutting or calving. They did farming in a small way, in the traditional ways that one learns about native farming, the corn and beans together and other things like that, so that they could sustain themselves the rest of the year. So I can look at these things in part with an outsider view as someone who claims native heritage. In a more immediate way, also as a person from the LGBTQIA community, I have a slightly outsider view even of the social expectations of Americans in the last century, and in my own life have both enjoyed the increase in acceptance and opportunity that the LGBT community has in the United States today, including the right to marry. I'm old enough to remember when that was not the case, and in fact was myself formed emotionally and practically in a system in which people like me took it for granted that they would not be able to be public about their private feelings, pretty much if they wanted to have a reasonable, respectable public career. So I grew up expecting to have to hide who I was for the rest of my life, or at least preparing for the possibility of that and hoping that it wouldn't be true. I only say that because it, again, gives me a kind of an outsider perspective. These two images, the upper one is a group of children at Ellis Island in 1908, gathered from different nationalities and such for a photograph of the immigrant experience, at least as seen through the eyes of a child. And the other is a picture from the early 1950s of a kind of nuclear white American family looking at a beautiful home that they're hoping to buy. The post-war GI Bill idea that everyone should be a homeowner, every family should have at least 2 children, and that people still wore suits on normal days. Men still wore suits on normal days. I remember, and hats for ladies. I remember our first plane trip, my mother wore a suit and a hat and gloves. I think of that now as though it were the Victorian era. It's hard to imagine things being so different. My own family, I have to say, was all made up of immigrants except for the native portion. But what makes us, at least in my family story, a little different from some is that we don't have any recent immigrants in my family story. The most recent ones came in 1870, so right after the Civil War, from Germany. But all of the rest, and that was just one branch of my family, all the rest were already here. They settled much earlier on with the European migration or were native. So what do I hope for in this? Certainly not a return to new myth-making of the Norman Rockwell kind. This is an image from the 1940s of an increasingly diverse community, actually the 1950s. Norman Rockwell was a little ahead of his time, I think, in imagining a multiracial, multicultural America united by a sense of Americanness, as depicted in this picture, which shows people of different classes, people of different races. I think what we can hope for collectively as a society, is a deeper perspective on who we are and where we come from. We can hone our abilities to understand and listen to one another. We can redefine what we think is important. And as a person who believes that the image of God is visible in my fellow human beings, and in fact in creation as a whole, we can help cultivate the idea of seeing God in the humanity of other people. Also, because I'm pragmatic in my way of looking at things, I think it's important to distinguish between things that we can change by changing laws, by changing attitudes, and things that are harder to change, or maybe in some cases immutable. The suspicion of other people, the anxiety that one might not get enough of whatever is available in the world. This is not based just in culture or race or anything like that. It's a human quality. The suspicion of people we don't understand or who look different from us, I think is more than sociological. It's theological in a sense, and we try to avoid talking about original sin these days. But if there is something that we can point to, I have a Jewish rabbi friend who likes to say the Christian doctrine of original sin is the only one he can think of for which he can see daily evidence of its truth. But the ability to get beyond ourselves is what I would define as the center of original sin. Obviously in relationship to God, alienation from God, thinking that somehow we can do what we want and God is somewhere else. And of course then in regard to one another as well, that what I need is more important than what you need. I'll come back to this at the end, but I think there are some signs of hope in this conversation. Certainly one of the things we're trying to raise at this convocation is how we talk about these things collectively. Kirsten Powers tomorrow will give us more on that. But if we can build greater trust, understand the common societal goals in ways that people can accept, and redefine the promises that society has made to people that have disillusioned them, we'll be better off. And I think it's important for us not to rebuild myths that have been dangerous to us in the past, and if possible to dispel them, to harvest deeper insight, and to realign ourselves toward a celebration of the good things that we stand for, and while lifting up also the things we still hope will change. I think this is a wonderful topic about which I wish I knew more and wish I could say more, but I have always been fascinated by how the European imagination of North America has been so powerfully optimistic and hopeful. People came from Europe to America thinking they were going to a place that was free of all the things they didn't like about where they came from, and was essentially a tabula rasa, kind of an open table of what they could achieve with the civilization and the morality they brought with them from the old country onto this new country, this wilderness, where only nature was to be encountered. And of course, they knew more or less that there were native inhabitants there already, but some of them put those people in the category of nature as being part of the environment, like wild animals. Others believed that they would, of course, be welcomed by any North American residents because they brought with them such rich gifts of civilization, of a way of understanding themselves, of being able to divide the land up so you knew what belonged to whom, and all of these things that the natives had no idea they needed, and were foreign concepts entirely. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how powerful these ideas are for Europeans. They draw people to America, and they shape their understanding of what they're going to do when they get there. And I'm using two images for that. One of them is contemporary with the idea it depicts, and the other one is a little anachronistic. The one at the bottom here on the left is a picture some of you might have seen. It's of the famous Count Zinzendorf, the founder of the Moravians, who made a trip to the United States, to the American colonies, I should say, in the middle of the 18th century to visit the Moravian communities that had been established in Pennsylvania. And on his visit, he had a special interest in meeting Native Americans, because part of the purpose of Moravian missions to the New World was to convert them, to bring them the benefits and joys of Christian faith, so that they too might be part of the community of the saved, the baptized and the saved. And this painting, which was done in Europe, represents a vision that Zinzendorf had, even there, of Christ calling to himself what the first fruits of the nations, that is, the children of every race and place. That this is a fairly common evangelistic idea among American Protestants later, but Zinzendorf was ahead of his time in seeing this multiracial kingdom of the converted, embracing all people through the world. And empowered by this sense that people would be grateful to receive the saving message of Christ, he empowered his communities not just to sustain themselves, but wherever they went, to be there for the natives as well. It didn't work out as it hoped. These kinds of projects never did, but it has to be said that the Moravians, more than most American Protestants, actually did care about and saw their native siblings as a key part of what they did, much longer than others who eventually gave up because the natives were not receptive to them, were not particularly interested in becoming like them, and in fact were trying to avoid them by moving farther and farther away to avoid contact as much as possible. The Moravians, for them it was difficult to finally give this up and concentrate on themselves. Eventually they had to, under pressure from other white people who were threatened by the fact that the Moravians were doing this boundary breaking kind of work in which they were actually creating Indian Christian villages that were not run by white people. And that was scary to the British, especially to the governing authorities, because you couldn't persecute, you couldn't massacre Christians in the same way you could natives who weren't Christians. So it was moving them too far into the European column. Another optimistic one was also here in Pennsylvania with William Penn and the establishment of a new colony in which he hoped people would enjoy freedom to exercise religion that was not experienced even in his own England, let alone the rest of Europe, and open settlement to people dissenting Christians of many persuasions, and of course including ultimately Jews and other non-Christians in this Pennsylvania Commonwealth. And at the same time, Penn held up a very optimistic understanding of the relationships with the local natives, that through keeping one's word, by having clear treaties and agreements that the white people would try hard to observe, that peace could be maintained. Beyond peace, it's a little hard to know what else was envisioned. But certainly Quakers were in very many different places in their attitudes toward natives and, of course, in their attitudes toward the enslavement of Africans. But some principles of liberty and equality among humans did persist among Quakers more strongly than among other kinds of American Protestants. This picture, the other picture of the Peaceable Kingdom, a picture most of you are familiar with, I'm sure, showing the lion lying down with the lamb and two innocent children, white children to be sure, petting the leopards and such without fear of being torn limb from limb, while in the background William Penn is signing a treaty with the Lenape about the cession of lands along the Delaware. So this idea that by bringing in a humanly tolerant European government in North America, the kingdom predicted for the future in which all peace would reign among all creatures was being foreshadowed and presaged. Of course, the picture was painted by a famous naive painter of the Quaker tradition, Edward Hicks, who lived in Newtown in eastern Pennsylvania. He was a very, very distant cousin of mine. It's in this period also that, in the 18th century, that we begin to develop ideas of what it means to be American. That American as different from European. So that people had been in in North America, Europeans had been in North America long enough that enough generations had passed that they considered themselves to be their own thing and not simply citizens of the mother country. We know that the whole lead up to the American Revolution is a kind of complicated public negotiation about who are we being white Europeans in North America, as opposed to them, the people who are governing us from far away across the ocean. And this negotiation, of course, ends in open conflict, manipulated by some, terribly feared by others. But one of the key figures in that is also one of the people who most promotes, both in his life and in his writings, the idea of a separate American identity for Euro-Americans. And that's Benjamin Franklin, who has his own even set of ideas about what the American dream should be, because he's a rags to riches story in his own life. He believed that the perfection of individual virtue was what would bring prosperity to any individual, and that was something that Euro-Americans had to offer the world, an example of a prosperous, industrious population. Of course, he himself was a holder of enslaved people and had no regard for non-white people. Fairly little regard for natives, although there was a wary respect of the danger that natives still presented, especially in the untamed West, where natives were an obstacle to the settlement of white people. But in his own description of himself in the lead up to the Revolution and the redefining of Americanness, Franklin plays a really key role in that. And if you want to know more about that, there's an excellent, excellent book called The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin by Gordon Wood that was published in 2004, but it's still the best thing I have ever read on Benjamin Franklin. Out of this and the story of the Revolution, of course, comes the idea of America. Mostly still Eurocentric white America, but a country on the move. One of the things I was recently struck by a new biography of George III, for which I've forgotten the citation, but if you look up George III on Amazon, I'm sure it will come at the top, argues that the American colonies were too big, too populous, and too rich to remain part of the British Empire. That if they weren't going to be independent, they would have had to be dominant. And there was no way that the political structures could have allowed them to be dominant over over Britain itself. So that the separation was inevitable in some ways. And I think that's a really interesting argument. It says something about the fact that this idea of nationhood on the American side of the Atlantic was already in place in some ways and simply needed to be given the framework of people like Franklin and, of course, the founders, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I'm going to jump over a lot in the interest of time, but I think this image is the most powerful one I can think of in its illustration of a simple-minded understanding of white American progress and the creation of a forward-looking American nation that I have seen. It's by an immigrant artist named John Gast, who had come to North America from Germany. It was painted in about 1872. It's a little anachronistic even in its own time. So it's a myth being illustrated in a clear public way. And it depicts a personified America, the goddess Columbia, itself a colonizing image, and she floats above, a white figure dressed in white floats above the earth in a gentle way. Over her arm, or in her hand, is a book of laws. Over her arm is a bale of telegraph wire, which she's extending behind her from the east, where you see in the background a busy city and plenty of ships on the river, presumably the Mississippi. And you see the advance that has happened already. She is pointing toward the advance of the future. And she has in her wake, she has trappers and explorers and miners in the foreground, and behind them, farmers with their ox and their plow. They're just cultivating as they go across the prairie, building homes behind them. You see the stagecoach both for transportation, but even more for communication, for ability to get mail across, and the Conestoga wagon with the settlers in it in the middle, and the train not far behind, the railroad following up to cement this progress in place forever. And of course, on the very left edge of the picture, you see the fleeing bison and natives and wolves. So kind of equated. Two forms of nature. At the top there are the bison receding into the distance. In the middle foreground, natives and kind of retreating in disarray. And then in the foreground there's a wolf. I think it's a wolf. It might be a bear. It's actually probably thick enough to be a bear. But in any event, it represents the wilderness, overcoming the anxiety and the fear, in a way, of this untamed, unsettled land to people who were trying to settle it. Even now, my immediate family, through some accidents of family history, all live in Montana. That's not where we come from, but they've lived there for a long time and love it very much. And I'm struck when I visit there by the constant dialogue between those who want to use the land for agriculture and those who want to preserve it for the enjoyment of nature, and especially in regards to wolves and bears and other creatures that will eat the livestock that the ranchers are trying to raise, and how there's even now a conflict between the wild and the tamed in that part of the country. And so the vast geography of the North American continent, the idea expressed in Manifest Destiny that it was the American historical fate to control the entire continent from shore to shore and eventually to link them together closely. These were all ideas that dominated the creation of the American myth in the 19th century. But what's most important, I think, for our concerns today is what the myths conceal, that they don't include everyone. They create an idea of progress for increasingly waves of further European immigrants. With the exception of the Chinese laborers brought to work on the railroads, some of whom actually came at the time of the gold rush at the end of the 1840s in California. Except for them, the migration is essentially European still, and the people who have been brought in the past to be enslaved in the South from Africa. And that's what's missing in all of this. Any sense that the descendants of those enslaved people have a place in this American story. Of course, we know a great deal more about this than was in school textbooks of the time, even as the public school system was developing in the period around the Civil War and afterwards. The story of America that was being taught to, at least to white European descended children, was one that excluded the story of human slavery in large part, except for, in the North in particular, and in the wake of the Civil War, actually in the lead up and the wake of the Civil War, works like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was enormously the most successful American novel probably ever written in some ways, which, in contrast to the historical narrative that young people are getting, that, for all its flaws and romanticism, puts the evil of slavery right in the middle of the story and makes it indelibly present for the reader. I've not done any study of this, but it would be very interesting to know how that book was received across the American population, whether white Southerners, for example, read it in the same degree as white Northerners did. But it was also part of the framing of the American story for the rest of the world, because until the 20th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the single American work of literature that was translated into the largest number of foreign languages. So it was read around the world. I've come on antique copies of it from the 19th century in Swedish and German and all these other languages that for many people it was the only American book they'd ever read. And so in some ways the European understanding of the American myth might be better than the American understanding of the American myth, because it isn't clouded with all the stuff that we use to conceal the fact that that the European settlers had dispossessed the native population and practiced a form of cultural genocide at least, and in some ways actual physical genocide, mostly connected with the forced removal from one land to another, or the removal of sources of food. In the case of my tribe, we were not relocated, but we were deprived of the buffalo herds that the tribe depended on for survival, and made dependent on the government, so that we could then be forced to live in places that the government had chosen for us. And of course, human chattel slavery, which was a systemic denial of the full humanity of Africans and African Americans, their descendants, and which, in spite of the war for liberty and the end of slavery that this location represents, remained a broken promise, remained an unfulfilled promise of equality, in spite of constitutional amendments and other ways in which this was attempted to be enshrined in American systems. The actual equality of black Americans is still not present in our world, and is the principal thing, at least in my experience of the United States, that stands in the way of any myth-making about American progress, about the wonders of our system. And these are issues that are still unresolved. Also, and this is not so much talked about, is that the freedom of religion that brought some immigrants to North America, not as many, I think, as is commonly thought, but economic motives were the most important. But for those, that subset in which a desire to be able to exercise their religion freely was an important part of the decision to migrate to North America, over time, that did not bring greater tolerance. That in fact, the dominant, the hegemonic, to use the academic term for it, religious understanding was that of white Protestantism from the British Isles in particular. That there was even a lot of the people in this room and on our extended audience are Lutherans, and they will know that Lutherans were, for the most part, foreigners for at least a few generations before they were able to assimilate fully, before the language of their religious culture became the language of the dominant culture in which they lived, and English was their way of communicating. And even now, depending on how long the migrants, how many generations they've been in this country, even now some Lutherans cherish that ethnic connection to their ancestors in another country. And that makes Lutherans a little different from other American Protestants, because of all the great Protestant groups that are significant in the United States, Lutherans are the only ones who in the 16th century didn't have an English-speaking country. That every Lutheran spoke a non-English language and had to assimilate into an English-speaking world here. So unlike Presbyterians or Episcopalians or Methodists or any of the others who came out of the British Isles, we had some assimilating to do. But the religious intolerance that develops in the United States is really rooted in New England Protestantism, in a way, to the rather Calvinist influenced ideas of Protestantism, in which God rewarded the virtue of some and punished the impiety of others. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'll stop with that one now, and maybe we can follow it up later. What I've discovered is to talk about these things that are concealed by the American myth, the promises that were not kept, is to, in this overheated age right now, immediately to invite backlash. That it's hard to bring these things up. I do it even with this, I think, relatively sympathetic audience, only with some trepidation, because one could immediately be accused of not caring about America. And we hear that overheated rhetoric in lots of ways today. The simplest thing to do is to say, well, if you think that, then you hate America. And I'm probably going to eliminate my Twitter account today because of Elon Musk and other stuff like that, although I haven't cared about it for a long time, and so it won't be much of a loss. But it is there in particular that I see this kind of reactivity that is simply a counterpunch. It isn't an argument, it's a striking back. And you and your mother, just get right back at you, so you're clearly wrong. It's the reactivity of privilege that it's not a framework for conversation. It is attack by a person who feels attacked in some way. And the saddest part of it is that it deprives us of the opportunity to understand the history of this country in a richer, more nuanced way. It closes the conversation before it begins. The love it or leave it idea is one that doesn't allow us to acknowledge the tragedy of American history, which is as fascinating a part of it, as important a part of it, as whatever one might describe as its glory. That what makes this a remarkable civilization or culture or country or whatever it is exactly, what makes it so remarkable is its complexity and its diversity, and not some overarching idea of how it ought to be or ought to have been. And instead we have a kind of a culture in which people feel they have to take sides. To say one thing is to be against another, the zero-sum way of thinking, that all lives have to matter, because you can't acknowledge that some lives don't matter as much. And we see the evidence of that every single day, like original sin. Racism is the only social sin that we see evidence for in around us every day. But what's even more significant to me, and I'll make this the big concluding judgment on this topic, for me at least today, is that the American dream has shifted from being one of opportunity for people of enterprise and energy, which is kind of what it was before, even though that was always imperfectly enacted and imperfectly experienced, to one that is almost exclusively consumerist today. Now, part of the old American dream was to be able to participate as equals in a democracy in which people mattered, everybody mattered. And now the American dream is about having enough stuff. I'll admit that I didn't know this until this week, but the American dream is both a concept and a location. It is actually a mall in East Rutherford, New Jersey, called American Dream, of which this is a picture. I thought the Mall of America was in the Twin Cities was the biggest in the country, but it's been greatly superseded by this one in New Jersey, which was supposed to open just about the same time the pandemic hit. And so its future has been called into some question, but it's nonetheless, as you can see, it was set up and it was ready to go. In a book, a really interesting book about a poor rural agrarian African-American population in Mississippi at the beginning of the 20th century, and how it was tempted, drawn into what we now call the Great Migration northward. A man named Ted Owensby in 1999 wrote a really good book about how much of that could be traced specifically to economic hopes, and which is perfectly natural for impoverished people to want to go to a place where the opportunity was greater, but that there was an idea, a concept about what was going to be the case at the other end, another promise, by the way, that doesn't get kept. What they would find, the migrants would find as they went north, that was mythological as well, promoted by those who wanted the migration, to help the migration, contested by those who didn't. And Ownby, the author, identifies 4 consumer dreams by which he describes the American dream in this 20th century way. The first is the dream of abundance, that everyone can have the stuff they want. There's enough. The second is the dream of what he calls the democracy of goods, that no matter where you are in society, you can enjoy the same stuff, that really rich people might have televisions that are slightly bigger than less rich people, but they're still televisions. They're still based on the same technology, and that basically anyone can have anything they can manage to get the money together to buy, and that there isn't a stratification by class. And the third dream is the dream of the freedom of choice, that each person or family can constitute its own lifestyle based on what it can pull together of the goods of the world and how they want to live. Obviously, there are economic challenges to all of this. And then the fourth one is the dream of novelty, that there will always be new stuff. There will always be more. There will always be a better one. And, you know, advertising really feeds that. We at home, Rob and I mostly watch things on through Roku from the internet, so we don't see as many commercials as we used to. But even the commercials we can't avoid are always about something people already have, but they need to have a better one, or a newer one, a faster one, sleeker, whatever qualities the product has. And of course, the more expensive it is, the more urgent it is that you have the latest issue. And so this is really an economic kind of dreaming that is very pervasive, that we have a whole economic system structured on getting people to want to have things that they may not need. I mean, everybody needs transportation, everybody needs housing, everybody needs food. There are basic needs. And it can't be denied that the engines of the economy have given people a greater variety and choice of things. We go to the grocery store today, you can buy things you couldn't buy when I was a kid. And where to something extraordinarily exotic and out of this world odd was a pizza. And because we ate German American farm food most of the time. And in some ways, consumerism is the new myth maker of the American dream. And it's one that isn't controlled by anyone in particular. It's a crowdsourced one, in a sense. And what used to be the American dream, which was mostly about land, I think you could make this whole lecture be about how people wanted, acquired, and defined their ownership of land. And that's especially pertinent in the Native American context, because all the land was native land, at least in a theoretical way, until the Europeans arrived. Now it's really about purchasing power. How can I have enough of the stuff that I need? The country is changing. We know that. We know that in our bones. We see it around us. The country is becoming less white, which is a very good thing, I think, in my view. The diversity is increasing. There is a very important generational change occurring. I know that it's commonplace for every generation to wonder at and complain about the rising generation behind it. I'm sure our parents did, and the grandparents as well. But there are some things that are really different now. The rise of the digital native, people who've lived in this virtual world since they can't remember otherwise, that really is pretty fundamentally different. And for those of us who are still clinging on to some of the advantages and privileges we had from the previous incarnation of life, we can view this with some dismay, I think. One of the things that most disturbs me about the change in our society right now is the lessening consensus about the value of public education, that the public schools have become a battleground for ideological issues, and they always have been to some degree. We shouldn't pretend this is an entirely new thing, but it's really being done more baldly now as a way to destroy them in places where school boards now have people on them whose political principle is the reduction of public schools. That's hard for me to imagine. The greater mobility of our population, that's a mixed blessing, but also for the most part represents greater opportunity. The lower cultural value that religion has, which is a whole other topic that people who are invested in church care about a lot, but is also having a pretty devastating impact on our institutional life. That's a real thing. And as I started with, the polarization in society and the rising individualism that we face. If you want to know more about these things, there are some fascinating books about the changing of America, and especially of white reaction and rejection of change over time. There's a fantastic book by Carol Anderson called White Rage that talks about how racism underlies some of the anger in America against change. There's a really nuanced and really interesting book by Jonathan Metzl called Dying of Whiteness, which takes healthcare as its paradigm and talks about how many people would prefer not to have healthcare that would keep them alive longer because they're afraid people will receive it who don't deserve it in their understanding. And this is oddly kind of a class suicide thing, that people would insist so strongly on depriving others of things they don't deserve that they would actually deprive themselves as well. And it goes back to Thomas Frank and What's the Matter with Kansas, and all those other books about how people vote against their own self-interest because they are convinced by ideology that the changes that are proposed are somehow inimical to their values, even if practically they would improve their lives. And I've just acquired a new book, which I got to reading this week and took up far too much of my time because I was so absorbed by it, because I practiced genealogy as a hobby, called A Nation of Descendants by Francesca. And it talks about the rise of genealogy as a political concept in the United States. And there's some predictable things. People who wanted to belong to the DAR were both cementing the place of women in society because they were the daughters of the American Revolution and actually come before the sons. But also the idea that white Americans wanted to connect themselves to the past in a way that couldn't be disputed in a world that was changing too fast for them. But that over time, all kinds of other groups have sprung up who have taken up the same mantle. And now with mass genealogy on the internet and DNA-based genealogy, there's a kind of broadening and democratization of the whole area of genealogy that no one could have conceived of a few generations ago, where it was an elite hobby of people who could afford to travel to archives and graveyards and in their spare time and look up their ancestors. So it's become much more nuanced and interesting. So for me, this is a picture of the United States at night from a satellite, so you can see where people live by the intensity of the brightness. The question is, what kind of hope can we find in all of this? And I would say, for me at least, the signs of hope lie in the possibility that in some way genuine communication and maybe even genuine community might be possible to build it through media in a virtual realm. The pandemic has pushed us a long ways toward understanding that meaningfulness can be found in other ways than face-to-face. And although I don't think that it'll ever replace the basic need of a person to be in the presence of another person, there are still ways in which we can communicate. If we develop the skills for it, we can communicate effectively even in the virtual realm. On the economic level, I think the jury's out on whether we can supply the nation's population with all the things they need and want. We certainly are not doing a good job of that on a global level. Hunger still persists. But the idea with the rise of anxiety about climate change that we're all in this together on Earth gives me some hope that we can begin to think more globally, even while we're stuck in the myths of our local existence. I'm hoping that that'll be a corrective over time, especially with the shift of generations, because the rising generation is much more concerned with these global issues than the fading one. And the last hope I have, and this is more a hope than really a realistic expectation, is how we manage and whether we can avoid open conflict within our population. I see the level of anger as being really scary at the moment. That and the sea of guns in which we are awash really makes it scary for me. And I'm not pointing fingers particularly because I have relatives who've been collecting guns since the 1960s because they were afraid that someday they'd need them to defend themselves against their neighbors. But never knowing quite why. The fear was there before the understanding, and even now the understanding isn't clear. Who they're afraid of exactly, but that we really have to get at that if we're going to get anywhere. What is it that we are collectively afraid of, and how have our myths and our broken promises made us that way? I hope that Kirsten Powers is going to give us some more answers to that tomorrow, and that Dr. Smallwood in her presentation tomorrow will also give us some useful perspectives on this. I lead you only with the open-ended question, leave you only with this, that it is going to be hard for us to reframe our national narratives in ways that bring everyone to the table and that guarantee that, or that can make promises that don't have to be broken. Thanks for your attention here. I'm grateful that you came today.
Thank you, Dr. Erwin. And at this time, we're welcoming comments or questions. Hopefully more questions than comments. you get a room full of pastors, strange things begin to happen. And for those of you who are with us via YouTube, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll monitor the chat window and raise those questions as well. Anyone? And please tell us who you are, and if you're an alum, what class?
Martin was fishing for that. I'm Jared Hawk. I'm class of 1967, 55th anniversary. But I'm not a pastor. Dr. Erwin, you spoke about a couple of ways in which Lutheranism is unique. These ways seemed to have a past rootage and focus. One, you talked about Calvinism in New England being so formative years ago. Two, you spoke about the fact that Lutheranism is the only, and I'd say ELCA Lutheranism, is the only mainline denomination that doesn't have an English-speaking background in Europe. Moving to the present, what unique opportunities, ways, treasures are there that Lutheranism should be vocalizing and stressing more in relation to all the perils you see in society?
Thanks. That's a really good question, and I'm happy that you asked it, because we do have some things we can bring to this conversation as Lutherans that are useful. The first is that our ethics, our ethic of being Christian, how it means to live a Christian life, is rooted in neighbor love and the orientation toward the neighbor. We get this directly from Luther through the Small Catechism, where the Ten Commandments are explained not as prohibitions against things God doesn't like, but instead instructions as to how to live out a godly life by care for one's neighbor and putting someone else's good above your own. This is a countercultural idea. It's a Christian idea, not uniquely Lutheran, but it is a way, if Lutherans are faithful to their theological roots, we have within us the capacity to be fairly subversive in American Christianity by asserting this. I don't know that we have the courage, because in some ways we're more American than Lutheran. But if we were to double down on things like that, we could. Another one is, of course, the idea of grace, which gets attenuated into the idea that everyone deserves everything good, which is an okay idea as it is. It's comforting, and it's nice to know that God is loving enough to love all that is created. But as a motivating instinct among human beings, it's not very powerful. It's a little pallid. And I think one of the things we could understand better is, rather than celebrating the grace we enjoy, trying to embrace practices and actions that reflect our gratitude to God for the grace we don't deserve. Because the corollary, what makes grace important, is that it is undeserved. And we jump immediately to the happy ending without considering the long and complicated story that gets us to the realization that God loves us anyway. Anyway is what we live from day to day, and how we fail from day to day to live up to everything that to the way that God loves us. We fail to love one another as God loves us. And this should be more, I believe, of our thinking. Not to make us feel guilty, but to put things in perspective, to understand them in their proper places. And this is the other kind of theoretical structuring of Lutheran theology that we don't hear enough about, in my opinion, is that Luther's idea that we call things by what they really are. And that human effort to justify human existence is always going to fail. It's going to be partial and incomplete over and against the greater love and justice of God. So understanding that to be inevitably our situation in life means that we will not invest in our own schemes and ideas and myths as though they were gospel truth, but rely instead on what works with one another. What difference does it make that we practice a particular practice? How does it help our neighbor? And if we judge things by their own standards and not by some abstract, magical understanding of how God sees them, we will actually be practical in our impact. And what happened in the past is gone. What happens in the future is yet to be determined. We have the right now to work on as Christians, and that is our main responsibility. So that kind of proper proportion between things is something Lutheranism also has to bring. I could go on. This is a whole different lecture, so I will stop with that. But there are 3 or 4 other doctrinal points that I think we could bring to bear. But the challenge for us is we don't know them well enough, and we're not able to articulate them clearly enough, in part because we haven't stressed learning about the faith as much as we have going to church, paying your tithe, being nice to people, that kind of thing. So anyway, yes, new question.
Susan Bianchi, 1974 class of Drexel Library School, which is now part of the computer school, which
Yes.
tells you how things have changed. So I'm going to talk about books. Have you read The Thundering Herd by Zane Grey?
I haven't. That's a classic book, but I have to confess I've never read it.
You should read it. It's very depicting what it was like when we were doing genocide on the buffalo, basically. And it just, I was blown away. I just read it recently. Are you familiar with the Carlisle Indian School here?
Oh, yes, very
Yeah.
much. I have distant relatives who were sent there from Oklahoma.
Yeah, so, yeah, because I know the Jim Thorpes from that area and et cetera. So, yeah, okay, like library science person.
Thank you. My husband has just begun a library science degree in midlife and is going to Clarion for it because the Drexel one is a little too scientific, a little too computer-based for him. He's a book person.
When I went there, they told me not to take the one computer course that there was because I had already taken the one computer course that there was at my undergraduate school, which, by the way, is Wilson College in Chambersburg, whose president is a partnered gay man like yourself.
Exactly.
They don't have a parrot, they have a cat.
Right. More power to librarians who, without us realizing it, still hold the keys to information in many ways. And even though the generation that lives mostly off the internet is waning, it is still an important part of our culture. And people who still know how to look things up the old way will always have a leg up on those who are at the mercy of electricity.
It's a great place to buy used books.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pastor Cobb.
Yeah, Jim Cobb, class of 73. When Theodore Roosevelt spoke at the dedication of Lutheran Memorial in Washington, he called Lutheranism America's sleeping giant. When will it wake up? I mean, we're just missing out of the public square, and I don't know how a church like ours gets represented more in the public square. I'm so tired of the news that brings, for example, in the last presidential campaign, a person identified as a bishop of a church. He wasn't. I mean, he had that title in a large metro congregation in Detroit. And where these people come from into the media stream and how underrepresented our mainstream faiths really are in media. So this public square is a big question in my mind.
I think it's an important one, too, the question of our presence in the public square as Lutherans. In some ways, our moment, if we had a moment, it's past, because we are a less significant part of the overall population than ever. But this is not our fault directly or our problem exclusively, because the place of mainline religion in general has declined. You know, for the line between the first justice of the Supreme Court, who was not a Protestant, a white Protestant, and the fact that we don't have a white Protestant on the Supreme Court now, and haven't for a while, is a really interesting shift in the demographics. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this. It's just that it's a change in the sort of hegemonic systems in a way. And And in a way, the Supreme Court was ahead of the rest of the country in the representation of people of other faiths. Certainly the first Roman Catholic was already in the time of Andrew Jackson. And the notorious Chief Justice Taney was actually the highest ranking Roman Catholic ever to serve in the American government until the election of John F. Kennedy. And so, well, that may not be true because there was at least one Catholic Speaker of the House, but I digress. I think the challenge for us today with the media is a two-pronged one. First, the media we have to understand it as news media as it is. It will go now to what it can see. In that battle between the ear and the eye, the thing that will show is the thing they can take a picture of. So a striking person, a conflict situation, something that can be filmed. So there's that. And we're just not that exciting to look at, I think, for the most part, Lutherans. The other thing, and conflict is one of the things that draws the camera, draws the reporter. And we have gotten into the news whenever we've done something about which we have disagreed internally. I mean, my election in 2013 was the 15 minutes of fame thing for me. And the next morning, my picture was on the front page of the newspaper in Madrid. I could never mentioned again after that. But it was like one more church does one thing new that some of its people don't like and that other churches won't like. So it gets into the attention of the media. The other thing is that because we do not teach about religion in any responsible way in this country, because we're too afraid we'll be confused with teaching religion, that the media, for the most part, are religiously illiterate. I know a lot of reporters I respect very much. But I know if they start talking about religion, they're going to make a terrible mistake unless they call somebody to check their facts. And just the assumption, for example, if you know a couple of things about Roman Catholicism, that you know anything about Lutherans is erroneous. And as a person who was a bishop, I got a lot of calls saying, well, what are you going to do about such and such a thing? Because can't you just do that? Can't you just remove that person? Or can't you just make this happen? They have no clue about how we actually govern ourselves. So the ignorance about how religion actually works in people's lives and how faiths are structured, and the fact that we're unsensational for the most part, and the very best thought out opinion by the very smartest Lutheran will never be interesting enough to get into the New York Times. But that could be said for any Presbyterian or Episcopalian or anyone else either.
Hi, I'm Brad Burke, class of 2006 at Philadelphia. I found it really interesting, and perhaps it was intentional, that I don't think I heard the word freedom come up during your presentation. And I do, at least my understanding, I think that freedom as self-determination has been a thread from the very beginning to today. That's kind of woven its way through at the center of what we now call the American dream. I found it interesting also where, in my mind, these two things are connected, but maybe only in my mind. I found it interesting where you located sources of hope. You mentioned media, online spaces, perhaps, and also kind of globalism or big picture things. And it really made, one thing I feel like I've learned the last couple years watching events unfold, shall we say, in our society. I found myself reading a lot of writings of Wendell Berry's, and in one of his essays he writes about we always, especially in the American context, want to think big, the big solution, the one-size-fits-all legislation, etc. And he says the only way, essentially, we're ever going to solve anything is to think little on the local level. And to Dietrich Bonhoeffer at one point wrote, "To love the neighbor who is within our reach." And so the thing that I feel that has been made clearer and clearer for me, and it may just be for me, and that may be enough, I think that hope is to be found on the ground in our local communities, and that perhaps we have eaten too much of the fruit of the temptation of the globalistic, corporate-driven, special interest-driven status quo. What do you agree or disagree with that big versus little? Is it both and perhaps
yeah.
you know, where would we start? What would it look like to try to rebuild community spaces where people know and love and care for one another? If we could kind of keep our eyes to the ground a bit rather than always trying to fix everything all at once.
Thanks. I think you put that very well. I see it more as a both and it would draw a distinction between having a global view and having a globalist view, which is to think that we can actually solve problems through some kind of overarching authority extending beyond what we already have. But certainly keeping the global in mind while practicing on the local level is important. The challenge to the local idea, I mean, I would like to say that the answer is to be found in getting off the internet and ringing your neighbor's doorbell. Because on one level, I think it is, but increasingly in this country at least, your neighbor is more likely to be somebody like you than ever before. I mean, that we are becoming more segregated, not just by race, that's always been the case, but even by way of looking at the world. That in the great sort, the shifting of neighborhoods, especially in urban areas, people are tending to live closer to people who are like them in all kinds of ways. And so I'm not sure, and here's where the challenge becomes more relevant to us as those who are practicing Christians, is that the only place where that might not be the case, where we might actually have some hope, are in faith communities, in congregations. Because those are places where increasingly people don't live next door. They go to a place, again, sometimes because of affinity, and sometimes because of likeness of race or other reasons, but not always. And that certainly in some traditions, and I'd like to think that ours is one of them, there is a greater openness to diversity within our faith communities. And so and because people are there for the purpose of hearing important things about what life means, we have, the door is wide open to the kind of conversation that can happen. In places where the churches are still segregated, as they are in many places, it's still the most segregated hour of the week, Sunday morning, but there, I think alliances between communities can help. It only goes so far before people feel more comfortable. It's too much work to try to incorporate other people's point of view. But even there's some hope. And leaders especially can model a kind of engagement with people not like themselves for the sake of their own congregations that I think can be helpful too. I wish there was an easy way to see through this, and I'm actually kind of straining to find signs of hope, to be honest with you. So, and I'm hoping that they're in the newer generation that I don't fully understand, and I can't predict what's going to happen. But as a person whose orientation is backward-looking in lots of ways, I can see more clearly the mistakes we've made than what the recipe is for not making them in the future.
Here's a question from Pastor David Rowe, class of 1981, Philadelphia, recently retired, I might add. He has a question about the current backlash against social and emotional learning in schools. He feels that it's ironic, given the low social and emotional maturity that has polarized our conversation and public discourse. How is it that we can raise the level of public discourse, perhaps revive the marketplace of ideas?
That's a really good question, because I think people of goodwill have been trying that really hard all along. And one of the early hopes of social media was that it would be a place where people could exchange ideas freely and constructively. And what we've learned is there can be kind of a zero-sum thing between the freedom, which is saying whatever you want to say without fear of repercussion, and the constructiveness of the conversation that follows. That the "you must hate America" reaction shuts these things down. And so I have to say I just don't know quite. I still think that the potential is there. A lot of the digital media are still relatively new to us. I mean, if anything that's happened within a single lifetime is, from the standpoint of a historian, too slippery to hold on to. And I think we're going to have to see where this develops. But as in anything, we can model in our own lives and our own use of such media a kind of considered and charitable way of doing it. Pastor Martin knows more than I do about this. He teaches about it. But I use social media very intentionally in very focused ways, and only there. And I don't allow myself to get drawn into conversations or arguments about things that I know we can't fix, however interesting they might be, however valuable my opinion might be on those things. I can keep it to myself if I don't think the medium is suited to a good outcome. And part of this is wisdom and impulse control, and things, I think those are things we can cultivate. So the jury is out on a lot of ways of communicating today, whether they will be more harmful or helpful. In the short term, harmful looks like it's in the lead, but I'm open to that changing, I guess. Now that I think about it, my optimism is always being held in check by my low view of human nature. So they will have to continue to be intentional.
Putting on your hat as the leader of the seminary, the photo of the United States at night that you showed pointed out the two distinct constituencies in our 15 synods: the bright light from Boston to DC, and the ever-dimming light of the Appalachian corridor, where success may be in affording a double wide. How do we prepare future clergy to speak to each other in those cultural divides that they serve, but to speak the gospel in the context of, and especially the Appalachian context of, diminished natural resources that had once sustained them?
Do you want to say who you are?
That's a wonderful question, and I do think about that quite a lot. There are a couple of challenges inherent in this. One is that though we do attract people who are going into ministry who share the values and experience of people in small towns and rural settings. And that's a good thing, because in the ELCA at least, 70% of our congregations are in communities of the population of 20,000 or less. Even though we still attract students like that, and we do our best to help them come into dialogue with others unlike themselves in constructive ways so they can learn from each other as well as from what they learn at seminary. This has become more challenging through the hybrid modalities of teaching that we have, but we still try to develop some intellectual community and foster a charitable understanding of each other's motivations so that people approach conversations with openness and not fear. The harder challenge is to help people who themselves come from urban or suburban backgrounds able to serve in smaller towns and less prosperous areas without condescension or artificial barriers between them and other folks. And this is a hard one. I think that the church is always, this is where it falls on candidacy committees and bishops as well, to really ask questions about people's openness to people unlike themselves. Because if I graduate from seminary and am approved for ordination by a candidacy committee, and yet am not capable of loving people profoundly different from myself, I might not be very successful in the parish. And you know, while I was bishop in Los Angeles, it was a time in which many of our younger pastors would come to me and say, I'm not sure I even know the people in my pews anymore, because many of them had made political choices that the pastors thought unthinkable. And how to go back into the pulpit after Trump was elected was tricky for a lot of those pastors. They just wondered what they could say. They didn't, even if they weren't talking about that, how can they understand people whose view of the world was so different from theirs? And I think of that as, that should be an eye-opening moment for us all about how easily we build walls between ourselves, and how urgently we need to understand people as people, with all of their fears and anxieties being part of who they are. Because I think there's fear and there's anger at the root of a lot of this. Fear underneath the anger even, the most basic of the feelings. And fear of change that is leaving some people behind. Fear of an era in which their children will not do as well as they were able to do. I mean, that's a very real, that's actually a reality for quite prosperous people too. That Rob and I had a couple over for dinner the other night who were classmates of his from Haverford College in 1990, so they're reasonably young people. They're just putting their kids through college. And one of them, who is an investment banker, said to us, I really worry that my kids won't be able to afford to buy a house. And I thought, for one thing, what have you been doing with your money? I mean, I couldn't imagine how somebody who probably has an income that is 3 times that of mine, and his wife works as well, could worry about this only having 2 kids. But it was a genuine concern for him. And if that is a concern for people like that, really 1%ers, imagine what it's like for everyone else. So, and I'll admit that some of our seminarians, like me, are people who've gone through life without being wealthy, but never particularly worried about what was going to happen next. And that might be a character flaw. But a little obliviousness of the abyss that lies ahead can be useful at some points in one's life, especially when you're young, because you have some time to make up for it. But I do think that that's a real concern, and as I say, not just for rural people or people at the lower end of the income scale. The world is leaving people behind, and the church ought to be a place where they can go, at least to be together, to hear a word of consolation and love, and a message that at the end of life, the end of the day, God loves us enough to have shown us that love through Jesus. And if we forget that that's our main job, is to reassure people of that above all else, then we cease to be the church and become a counseling agency.
Thank you so much, President Erwin. And if there are no other questions, I'm not saying that we don't have time for one more.
I'm not going anywhere.
Okay.
I'll be around.
We are going to have lunch at some point, but any other thoughts or questions? I do like to tell my students that they need to know the difference between a bale of hay and a bale of straw, because that is how we build relationships with God's beloved people in the Lutheran Church. So it comes in handy. Thank you all, friends, for being here this morning. And what, you don't know the difference between, we'll talk later. It's all good. Thank you for being here, friends, and we look forward to the rest of the festivities coming about. The links for tomorrow's lectures will be emailed out this afternoon. So thanks again, President Erwin, and blessings on your day, everyone.
Thank you.